I just want to welcome everyone to our Art and Research Center Symposium on Swamp Ecologies. As always, these programs are supported by the Knight Foundation. This symposium and the seminars held earlier this week reflect the Art and Research Center's engagement with the ecological landscapes and biodiversity of the Everglades and the broader ecosystems of Florida. I want to take a moment just to thank our seminar leaders from this week, Dr. Zachary Caple, who we will hear from in a moment, and who led a seminar titled Everglades, a Multi-Species Water World Under High Modernist Distortion. And I also want to extend a special thank you to Dr. Camila Marambio and artist Christy Gass, who led the afternoon sessions on their work as researchers and artists, as well as the field trip that we took yesterday to the mangroves of Deering Estate. I also want to thank our seminar participants who thoughtfully engaged and participated in these important conversations throughout the week. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our other Art and Research Center programs, including our list of seasonal seminars, our podcast, Tomorrow is the Problem, and our annual keynote lecture, which will be held late February of next year with the poet Kathy Park Hong. For our symposium today, we will hear from three anthropologists, Dr. Zachary Caple, Dr. Jessica Catalino, and Dr. Laura Ogden. We will have time for questions after each talk, and we'll provide a coffee break after the second talk in our sculpture garden. And I ask when you raise your hand for questions to also stand up so that everyone can hear you. For our first talk of the day, we will hear from Dr. Zachary Caple. Dr. Caple is an environmental anthropologist at Aarhus University, Denmark, and a 2023-2024 ACLS Fellow. His forthcoming book, The Human Asteroid Strikes Florida, The Mining Landscapes and Anthrobiogeochemistry of Phosphorus, investigates the human-altered phosphorus cycle as an agent of multi-species landscape change in Florida. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Caple for his talk, The Wood Storks of Lake Somerset, Multi-Species Landscapes of the Holocene Anthropocene Boundary Event. Thank you.
Hi, what a pleasure it is to be here today with all of you. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, ICA. Thank you, Knight Foundation. It's been wonderful to be here, and a special shout out to the participants of the Swamp Ecologies group. It was tremendous, and I'm transformed, and I'm grateful for all your contributions. Okay, here's a talk called The Wood Storks of Lake Somerset. Can you hear me okay? Great. During my field work, I would regularly go bird watching at a small neighborhood park in Lakeland, Florida, a sprawling suburban city along the Interstate 4 corridor between Orlando and Tampa. Sandwiched between khaki condominiums, the park is furnished with a tidy lawn, a few trees, and a bench that looks out on Lake Somerset. 50 feet from the lake's shore is an archipelago of long linear islands arranged in parallel strips. Lake Somerset is a water-filled pit in the Bone Valley Phosphate Mining District, the oldest and most productive phosphate mining and fertilizer manufacture zone in the world. The islands are made of overburden, the top layer of earth that a large mechanical excavator called a dragline removes and sets aside to access the phosphate rock. The parallel arrangement of the islands inscribed the path of the dragline as it roved up and down the landscape, mining in successive strips. Growing on the overburdened islands is Brazilian pepper, an invasive shrubby tree introduced to Florida through the ornamental plant trade. Pepper covers the islands and gives them a blobby, bristly character. Nestled in the vegetation are egrets, herons, roseate spoonbills, and most abundant of all, the Florida wood stork. The wood storks have made a rookery on these islands. Wood storks are a federally threatened species endemic to the mangroves of the coastal Everglades in South Florida. In the 1970s, wood storks fled the Everglades in droves as flood control and agricultural development fractured the hydrology of this iconic wetland ecosystem. In their diaspora, some of these storks set up shop in Bone Valley. In 2014, the wood stork's conservation status was downgraded from endangered to threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Bone Valley's Pit Lake Islands represent one strand of their partial recovery. Although wood storks have been removed from the endangered species list, to suggest that Lake Somerset's wood storks are thriving would be misleading. Storks are fledgling offspring, but the possibilities for colony expansion are eclipsed by suburban sprawl. At best, these wood storks may be said to be living in ruins. To live in ruins is to live in tolerable, potentially damaging, but nonetheless good enough conditions for ongoingness. Wood storks are doing okay. Brazilian pepper is doing better. Living in ruins is the story for many creatures of the Holocene who find themselves immersed in a sea of anthropogenic landscape change. In my research, I investigate the Bone Valley Phosphate Mining District as a ground zero of the Anthropocene. Often described as a moonscape, Bone Valley is an otherworldly mosaic of mining pits, contaminated tailings ponds, and massive chemical plants that turn phosphate rock into commercial fertilizers. As radically transformed as this mining region is, it is also a space in which Holocene ecologies and species can still be found, albeit in fragments. Wood storks are one such fragment. Chipped off the Everglades, forced into diaspora, and made to live in degraded urban industrial environments, wood storks are finding a foothold in the Anthropocene, however precarious. How do we make sense of such a condition? A Holocene species living in Anthropocene space? Hasn't the Holocene been eclipsed by the Anthropocene and its sprawling geographies of rubble, toxins, and weeds? There are, of course, protected wilderness areas that may be considered reservoirs of Holocene nature, but they are artifacts of people, the West no less. And therefore, are they not constructs of the Anthropocene too? The whole Earth has been humanized, or so the geologists charged with planting the golden spike would leave us to believe. So the geologists who are setting up, whose job it is to figure out when the Anthropocene exactly began. That's what planting this golden spike is. Humanists and social scientists, too, are seduced by the narrative of a fully humanized planet. In a keynote talk at the 2014 American Anthropological Association meeting, Bruno Latour encouraged anthropologists to embrace the gift of the Anthropocene periodization. With it, he argued, they might demonstrate the relevance of the discipline to the wider scientific community. Humans have spread out everywhere, and so anthropological expertise is needed everywhere. If geologists are to trace their research objects into the present, they will need anthropology and the human sciences more generally to make sense of the most recent developments in Earth history. While I'm convinced that anthropological and humanities knowledge practices are central to a transdisciplinary Earth science, I do not believe the planet has fully and irreversibly entered the Anthropocene. Too new to be a fully fledged epoch with its own historical character and systems properties, the identity of the Anthropocene so far lies with the capacity for disruption. But what exactly is being disrupted? And what form does this disruption take? Working within the geologist paradigm, the first question has an obvious answer: the Holocene, the relatively short interglacial epoch of the last 11,000 years. The question of disturbance and its formal character is more complicated. In contrast to the KPG event, in which the world of the dinosaurs was leveled in a single asteroid blast, the colonial capitalist disturbances that extinguished the Holocene are multiple, spatially patchy, historically staggered, and diverse. These disturbances create no analog ecosystems. They also fracture long-established natures, but such fracturing is rarely total. When we begin to map the morphology of anthropogenic blast zones alongside the incompleteness of their destruction, it becomes more and more difficult to accept the Anthropocene as a new planetary universal. We need not throw out the geological calendar altogether. Instead, we must open up our research and political imaginations to the landscape complexities of the Holocene-Anthropocene boundary event. In this talk, I argued that the Holocene-Anthropocene boundary event is the most precise characterization of the current planetary situation, and that multi-species researchers can play a lead role in its study. In my formulation, Holocene and Anthropocene are not timestamps on a geologic timeline, so much as ways of naming interacting but fundamentally incompatible formations of the planetary. Holocene and Anthropocene worlds coexist, overlap, and entangle. They do not come together in a balance of forces or a Manichaean struggle, but in a lopsided dynamic of erasure and feral emergence. The Holocene, in all of its biocultural diversity, is dying a patchy death as the Anthropocene, with its heterogeneous ruins, expands at a staggering pace. The total Earth system that is Gaia has not reached a critical tipping point that extinguishes Holocene lifeways once and for all, at least not yet. So this is my graphic model of the Holocene-Anthropocene transition. We're somewhere in the middle, okay? We're not fully in the Anthropocene yet, and this takes place at a kind of planetary scale, but mainly it's an Earth surface phenomena. So as we move more and more into the full-blown Anthropocene, the mosaic structure of landscape shifts from a kind of Holocene-dominated matrix with small Anthropocene patches to a more Anthropocene-dominated space in which Holocene worlds become islands. This is just to give you a sense of the geography of where this talk is taking place. Of course, we have the Everglades, South Florida. This is the historic nesting ground of the wood storks here in the mangroves. And this area here is Bowen Valley. That dashed line is the mineable limit, so where there's still phosphate that you can economically extract, and then the red areas are those areas that have been mined. And Lake Somerset is in the northern region of the Bowen Valley district. Investigating the current boundary event requires that we examine the Anthropocene's uneven emergence alongside processes of Holocene fragmentation. Whether our orientation is historical, rooted in the ethnographic present, or both, it is paramount that we inspect the patterning of Holocene and Anthropocene elements and their interactions in shattered space. In some sections of the Earth's surface, Holocene natures are long vanquished, relegating the place-specific study of Holocene-Anthropocene transition to historians and archaeologists. In others, Holocene and Anthropocene come together as contrasting patches in mosaic landscapes. In increasingly rare parts of the world, it is also possible to find Holocene ecologies that extend to the horizon from all angles. In the cores of these zones, multi-species patterns of co-survival, honed over thousands, if not millions of years, may continue to unfold as if industrial humans were not rapidly destroying the biosphere. When we conceive of the Anthropocene as a uniform condition with a single start date, we miss out on this heterogeneity and risk fetishizing ecologies with strong anthropogenic disturbance signatures as the new natural order. Nevertheless, the Anthropocene conversation has been a gift to the discipline of anthropology. In the last decades, environmental anthropologists have shifted away from discursive critiques of nature-culture binaries and the wilderness concept to develop more ecologically sensitive studies of environmental violence. When I started grad school in the late 2000s, environmental decline was treated as an alarmist narrative to be countered. In the past decade, we have lost our allergy to declension narratives. Today's anthropologists are ramping up their commitments to multi-species methods to interrogate the more than human dimensions of colonial ruination, industrial waste dumping, invasive species transfers, to name just a few Anthropocene conjuring practices. With the exception of a few who appear to celebrate the Anthropocene and the quote-unquote emergent creativity of its novel ecosystems, the Anthropocene discourse has awakened us to the scale and intensity of colonial capitalist disturbances and the cascading conditions of unlivability that they proliferate. And yet, a realignment is needed. The exuberant rise of Anthropocene discussions has blocked scholars' attention to the Holocene, its uneven patterns of erasure and persistence, and the life/death worlds of its remnants. Though Holocene usefully denotes the last 11,000 years of Earth history, I use the term more capaciously. In my usage, Holocene signifies an up-to-the-minute, non-Anthropocene configuration of Gaia. Prior to its present fracturing, this Gaia formation constituted the most biodiverse version of Earth, and through the orchestrations of its incalculable biotic and abiotic actants, it furnished a warm and stable climate, flourishing oceans, and many other critical functions that rendered the planet habitable. In its current fragmented condition, the Holocene continues to issue forth livability, but at a much reduced scale, and of course, with considerable geographic unevenness. Of course, the Holocene is not just a biospheric construction. In addition to being the most biodiverse epoch in Earth history, the historical Holocene supported the diversification of human cultures, with people dispersing around the globe, developing socio-ecological niches in all the planet's major biomes. Whereas many anthropologists adopt a strong version of the social construction of nature, in which ecological landscapes are never without a human architect, the Holocene, in my view, is principally a non-human assemblage. Consider the bioregion of flatwoods and cypress swamps that once extended across Bone Valley, including the area that is now Lake Somerset. Before the diseases and slave raiding of Spanish explorers that led to the demise of the Timucua, Tocobaga, and other indigenous peoples of Central Florida, this bioregion was used as a hunting and foraging ground. With settled life concentrated around the coast and secondarily inland waters, these ecosystems were economically marginal and consequently underwent little landscape modification, except perhaps for the occasional prescribed burn. On the coast, by contrast, Florida's native peoples engaged in more intensive terraformations, building monumental shell mounds and complex weir systems for capturing fish. Though these activities altered ecological trajectories, their impacts did not rise to the levels of irreversible violence that characterize Anthropocene peoples and their ecologies. In addition to describing the Holocene as a timescape of human-non-human compatibility, historians and archaeologists must also confront the ways in which the Holocene sowed the seeds of its own undoing, functioning as an incubator for ecologically destructive humans, especially those weedy and European varieties who spread the machinery of conquest and industrialism around the globe. Anthropologists, too, can join in such big storytelling. But I contend that the empirical challenge of multi-species scholarship is to attend to the ways that the Holocene-Anthropocene boundary event actualizes in situated land, air, and waterscapes. In my research in Bone Valley, this has meant tracking the layered histories of invasion by which phosphate mining companies and their companion species have shattered Central Florida's Holocene ecosystems. In what remains of my talk, I provide a reading of Lake Somerset as an historical palimpsest, describing how a pre-settlement mosaic of pine flatwoods and cypress swamps were transformed into an Anthropocene assemblage of Pit Lake islands capable of supporting a colony of Holocene wood storks.
Okay. I mean, I think this is rather self-explanatory, and I'll be giving you 6 stories that correspond with each of these layers.
So we begin with a Holocene biome. If you were to visit Lake Somerset in 1800, you would have encountered a very different scene than you would today. Where today there is a pit lake and condominiums, there was once a splotchy mosaic of pine flatwoods and cypress swamps. Flatwoods, as their name suggests, are found in flat, sandy lands formed in the rise and fall of ancient shallow seas. Flatwoods have a relatively open canopy of slash and or longleaf pine and a flammable understory of saw palmetto, grasses, and forbs. Ecologists describe flatwoods as the matrix that ties together and merges with other Florida vegetation types. Embedded in the flatwoods matrix are cypress swamps, dense shady forests with an understory of water-loving herbaceous plants that grow among cypress knees. With Florida's high water table, just a foot or two of elevation change can mark a sharp transition between the two ecotypes. In their Holocene configuration, this bioregion would seasonally flood and frequently catch fire, creating lush mosaics with ample habitat for panthers, alligators, and bears. 2. Cowboy. Holocene cowboys, ? Although Florida is not typically thought of as a cowboy state, the so-called Florida cracker represents a southern prong of the multi-species invasion that conquered the American West. As foot soldiers of empire, these ranchers aided the U.S. Army in its campaign against the Seminole and Miccosukee. Lured to Florida with land grants of 160 acres from the Armed Occupation Act of 1842, these cracker communities helped secure conquered territories and establish the basic infrastructures, roads, farms, commercial networks that paved the way for later waves of industrial and suburban settlement. Although crackers brought a violent political culture to Central Florida, they were relatively benign ecological actors. Like the native peoples that came before, ranchers used fire to manage a landscape pre-adapted for burning and grazing. The southeast open pine forests co-evolved with lightning strike fires that produce a hardy grass layer for wild grazers. The cowboys' cattle and their disturbance practices fit into the region's eco-niches in more or less nonviolent ways. But they were not without influence. At low stocking levels, fire and grazing can enhance floristic diversity. But at higher levels of grazing pressure can lead to significant plant diversity declines. As late as the mid-20th century, however, most Florida ranches were only semi-improved and possessed the ecological structure of a floristically depleted prairie. Aerial photos from the 1940s reveal semi-improved pastures in the area that would become Lake Somerset. I have coded these pastures with a lighter shade of blue, reflecting the botanical losses tied to increased grazing. I've coded the cattle trails red to signify the colonial pathways that ranchers and their cattle literally and figuratively etched across the land. Although the landscape became more anthropocenic, it remained, from a biological perspective, a predominantly Holocene configuration. Layer 3, mining the Anthropocene. The landscape's transition to a more fully Anthropocene state begins with mining. This section of Lakeland was first strip mined for phosphate as part of a complex called Poway Mine. The history of individual mines is difficult to sort out, but I have been able to piece together a few key details. The Poway Mine was opened shortly after the incorporation of the Southern Phosphate Company in 1919. Headquartered in New York City, the Southern Phosphate Company formed through the consolidation of 4 existing phosphate companies with an initial investment of $30 million. In 1946, the company was purchased by its largest shareholder, the Davison Chemical Company of Baltimore. 8 years later, the Davison Company was absorbed by W.R. Grace, a large phosphate magnate with roots in the 19th century Peruvian guano trade. In the 1950s, W.R. Grace excavated the pit that would become Lake Somerset. It was one of the last units mined at Poway before the complex closed in 1960. The long distance between the company's headquarters and its production zones was typical of many post-Reconstruction industries. In the decades after the Civil War, northern capital flowed into Florida, intensifying its status as an internal resource colony of the United States, and sedimenting inequalities among northern investor class and people, including poor blacks, who carried out the backbreaking work like mining. In 1938, Paul Diggs of the Federal Writers Project visited the segregated labor camp at Poway Mine. There he met William Jackson. On the day he arrived, Jackson had spent the night in a mining pit, mending a 12-inch water line. This is one of the drag lines at Poway. The pit had filled with water, which discolored his skin. William explained to Diggs that he worked on a crew composed of a foreman, a nozzle man, and 4 flunkies, charged with setting up high-pressure water guns called hydraulic giants, used to dislodge phosphate from the pit walls. At present, I'm a nozzle man. My salary is $30 per hour for 8 hours work, making $2.40 a day. We only work 4 days a week, which gives us $9.60. At this, Jackson's wife piped in, "You see, we sure have to scrape, and it's the bills that face us." In addition to the low wages, work in the mines was dangerous. At the Poway mine alone, there were multiple deaths and injuries, all of black laborers. In 1946, 1 man was electrocuted and 3 others badly burned when their drill pipe fell across a high-voltage electric line. In 1927, a cable broke on a drag line, causing the boom to drop, killing 1 man and injuring 2 others. The racialized disparities between metropolitan investors and peripheral workers is, of course, a richly documented feature of modern capitalism. What remains less understood is how capitalist systems, whose social logics we know all too well, infiltrate and transform the landscapes from which they extract value. As I've described, the terraformations of phosphate strip mining are radical. Pre-existing ecosystems are bulldozed into a pile and burned. The drag line inverts the topsoil, piling it into rows. The pit crew comes in, using their water guns to gouge holes into the earth. At Lake Somerset and across Bone Valley, it is these disturbance practices that precipitated the Holocene-Anthropocene transition. In other geographies, the specificities of Holocene-Anthropocene transitions will differ. However, the local transformation is enacted through a single devastating blast or overlapping forces of slow violence, I propose they can be adequately theorized by attending to processes of creative niche destruction. Creative niche destruction is my term for describing how colonial capitalist disturbances irreversibly altered the biophysical structure of space. The term is a portmanteau term that hybridizes the Marxist concept of creative destruction and biological theories of niche construction. Let me briefly introduce the individual concepts before showing how they fit together. Creative destruction generally refers to the processes by which the avant-garde forces of capital tear down, reconfigure, or revolutionize pre-existing social and infrastructural orders that pose a barrier to accumulation. I mean, gentrification is a really good example. In order to create the new, capital must raise and reappropriate that which came before. Niche construction theory explores the roles that organisms play in the production of environments. Beaver dam building is the most iconic example of niche construction, but all organisms engage in engineering practices of one sort or another. Furthermore, niche construction activity takes place at all scales, manifesting in landscapes and the micro to macro Earth system that is Gaia. A core tenet of this theory is that niche construction activities of the past structure ecological, evolutionary, and developmental trajectories of the future. The environments built by our more than human ancestors become the milieus that we rework and bequeath to our successors. Creative niche destruction brings these phenomenal processes together, helping us to notice the ways that colonial capitalist projects destroy pre-existing landscape relations while simultaneously creating niches for insurgent Anthropocene life forms, human and non-human. As capitalist frontiers expand, Holocene natures constantly get in the way, requiring land clearing, draining, earth moving, etc. Such disturbances are not akin to the fires of traditional land management that regenerate long-standing ecosystem relations. Rather, colonial capitalist disturbances are typically of a scale and intensity that they irreversibly alter environments so that the organisms that lived there before can no longer live or struggle to live in the environments that came after. Paying attention to the before worlds and after worlds of creative niche destruction helps us distinguish Holocene and Anthropocene patterns in a landscape. If you were to take a stork's eye view of Lakeland today, you would see a number of subdivisions snaking around the shores of former phosphate pits. In the early 20th century, this wouldn't have been the case. There was plenty of open space to go around. Phosphate mining was over here, suburban development was over there. But by mid-century, as Lakeland began to grow, Bone Valley's monstrous landscapes of mutilated soil became a barrier to urban expansion. Real estate developers complained to the local Chamber of Commerce, who in turn agitated the Florida legislature to pass a bill mandating fertilizer companies to cover their pits in development-friendly ways. Mining companies were eager to perform the responsibility to the local community, but with earth-moving costs around $500 per acre, they complained that repairing the land cost more than they originally paid for it. Nonetheless, the Davison Chemical Company, with its mining operations close to the growing city, began to experiment with reclamation strategies at Poway. Putting the landscape back together was a challenge. Drag lines proved ineffective because of the treacherous condition of the freshly cut pits. In one of Davidson's early attempts, a bulldozer slipped into a mine. Workers improvised a dam around the $10,000 machine and managed to pull it out. Eventually, the efforts of the real estate lobby paid off. In 1975, the Florida legislature passed a bill mandating the reclamation of all new mines. Including in the legislation was a severance tax on phosphate that created a $7 million trust for the reclamation of old mines and the founding of the Florida Institute for Phosphate Research, a state agency that supported research into development-oriented reclamation strategies. Designs for post-mining land use were quickly integrated into mining plans. In peripheral areas of Bone Valley, mines were reclaimed into pastures and citrus groves. Along the edges of sprawling Lakeland, mines were transformed into golf courses, strip malls, and tract housing. The Chamber of Commerce had succeeded in mediating a détente between the two industries, allowing suburban modes of capitalist development to expand without interruption. In the 1980s, developers built the khaki condominiums around Lake Somerset, transforming pits that were previously eyesores into lakefront property. So from the invasion of snowbirds, we're going to turn to another kind of invasion and look at Brazilian pepper. This is the plant that colonizes the islands and that forms good nesting material and platform for the wood storks. Brazilian pepper is native to Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. It has shiny, compound leaves with white flowers that ripen into attractive sprays of red berries. A few meters in height, pepper trees form dense, impenetrable stands that block the growth of other plants through shading and the release of allelopathic chemicals. Pepper is a prolific seeder and is dispersed by passerine birds like robins and waxwings. Pepper is a prolific seeder and is dispersed, oh, I just read that, redo. So pepper is a prolific seeder and is dispersed by birds. In 1898, Walter T. Swingle, a U.S. Department of Agriculture horticulturalist, obtained a shipment of seeds from Algeria, derived from an unknown locale that were propagated at the plant introduction station in Miami. So they don't really know where in South America they came from because they went through this indirect route in Algeria. A second introduction occurred in 1926 when Dr. George Stone received pepper seeds from somewhere in Brazil and planted them in his garden in Punta Gorda on Florida's southwest coast. Stone distributed these seedlings freely among his friends and plant lovers, and many were planted along the city streets. Later genetic analysis would reveal that Swindle, who brought Brazilian pepper to Miami, and Stone, who brought it to Punta Gorda, that their pepper seeds came from two different parts of Brazil, the north and southeast, respectively. These two pepper stocks represent two distinct genetic types, or haplotypes, that were separated by an 800-kilometer distance in their native range. For several decades, birds and human gardeners slowly spread the Miami haplotype west and the Punta Gorda type east. In the 1960s, the haplotypes met for the first time in central Florida. The plants hybridized, and pepper underwent rapid evolution. The Florida hybrid exploded across the peninsula, exhibiting higher survival and growth rates and greater biomass than its parents. Brazilian pepper is now one of the most invasive plants in Florida, covering more than 700,000 acres. Millions of dollars have been spent on its eradication. Given the histories of strip mining, suburbanization, and Brazilian pepper invasion, it is surprising to find a federally threatened bird at Lake Somerset, especially one indigenous to the tropical tip of the peninsula. So why would an Everglades bird immigrate to an industrial environment that has been degraded in so many ways? To answer this question, and as a way to conclude, I offer up one more story of creative niche destruction, this time in the Florida Everglades. Storks on the move. In the pre-settlement Holocene, the mangrove fringe of the coastal Everglades supported the largest wood stork rookery in Florida. In the late 19th century, hunters stalked storks to the brink of extinction to supply feathers to milliners in northern cities. Hats were being made with their feathers. As political pressure against the plume trade mounted and fashions changed, the rookeries recovered. But it wasn't too long before humans struck again, this time through a series of drainage schemes intended to improve the Everglades for flood control and agricultural development. The Everglades, as we all know now, is a complex wetland environment that, in its pre-European condition, overflowed Lake Okeechobee to form the slow-moving river of grass. Though wood storks formed nesting colonies in the mangroves, they foraged across many parts of the Everglades, including special sloughs that they depended on during the breeding season. In the winter dry season, water levels in the sloughs dropped and created isolated pools with high concentrations of fish. Storks would feast in these pools, building up the caloric and nutrient stores for laying eggs and feeding hatchlings. Like many Everglades critters, the wood stork's social biology was attuned to the wetlands rhythms of winter drought and summer flood. Agricultural drainage, beginning in the late 19th century, disrupted this rhythm. But it wasn't until the implementation of the high modernist Central and South Florida Flood Control Project, or CNSF, that the Everglades was placed on an irreversible Anthropocene trajectory. In 1948, a hurricane swept through South Florida, causing considerable damage to property. Rather than expose the folly of Everglades drainage, the storm prompted the federal government to double down on flood control and launch the CNSF. Backed by the engineering and financial muscle of the Army Corps of Engineers, the dike around Lake Okeechobee was strengthened. The large canals that diverted floodwater to the Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic Ocean were deepened and strengthened, and the lake's floodplain was converted to a massive sugarcane production zone, a zone, incidentally, that requires Bone Valley phosphates to flourish. These changes fundamentally altered the hydrology of the Everglades, spurring widespread drought and raging fires. As Everglades floodwater was flushed to sea, fish populations plummeted and wood storks starved. Most wood storks fled South Florida. The storks dispersed across Florida and into Georgia and South Carolina, adapting their Everglades lifeways to new landscapes. And it bears noting that the person who discovered this and documented it all was Laura's father, John Ogden. Attracted to its pit lakes, wood storks established several colonies in Bone Valley. Spoil Pile Islands share several of the architectural features of their native mangroves that make for useful breeding habitat. Alligators guard against egg-hungry raccoons, and the flexible branches of Brazilian pepper hold nests together in the tumult of summer storms. Despite these advantages, the pit affords little in the way of food. Unlike ordinary lakes that support rich marshes on their fringe, mining pits have a steep drop-off that occlude wetland development. Surrounded by subdivisions and strip malls, the birds must fly several miles across a busy toll road to forage in a recently restored marsh. As a breeding habitat, Lake Somerset simulates the Holocene conditions that these birds needed to reproduce their future. But in other vital respects, the landscape fails to provide. For some Holocene species, anthropogenic landscapes have positive affordances that outweigh their negatives, providing good enough habitat. Lake Somerset's wood storks are getting by. But as the planned and unplanned forces of Anthropocene invasion tighten their grip on Central Florida, this improvised life world is not guaranteed to hold. Wood storks have proven adept in navigating the growth of Anthropocene death worlds in Florida thus far, but their embodied ways of being in relation are not infinitely plastic. One day these storks may be forced to flee Lake Somerset, but where will they go? Given the breakneck pace of development in Florida and in adjoining Sunbelt states, the chances that there will be landscapes that meet the complex habitat requirements of storks grows lower and lower. In today's political moment, it is easy to prioritize functionalist projects like decarbonization and the Green New Deal, especially when re-engineering the carbon cycle aligns with the interests of green capitalism. It is harder to care about wood storks. It is harder because the disappearance of wood storks is more than the loss of a single species. It is symptomatic of a landscape death process that is spreading fractally across the globe. To care about wood storks is to fight for hydrological restoration in the Everglades and to fight suburban sprawl in Lakeland. These are complex, uphill battles that require full-body commitment that most suburban Floridians, many of whom are apathetic or even hostile to environmental concerns, will not or cannot take up. Of course, there are many that would want to fight the fight, but I think we're outnumbered. As entrenched as the present and future Anthropocene is, we need a politics of Holocene resurgence. The forces of man-made mass death are unbelievably powerful, but they must be resisted if we are to have some chance of shifting the Earth's surface, as well as our mode of becoming human, from emergency red to the Holocene's regenerative cool blue. Thank you. Sorry I'm so long-winded. This is a hard story to tell. Oh gosh.
So, I've always questioned the use of the terms invasive and colonized when we talk about species movement. And when we talk about species movement and ecological changes, I've always questioned the use of terms like invasive and colonized because they come from the same sort of military capitalist industrial complex that got us here in the first place, right? And so, is there, in your field, is there a movement towards imagining a new language that takes us to a different paradigm?
I mean, I kind of think, so the discourse-based critiques of invasive species are well developed in anthropology and allied disciplines. And I think, I understand the critique. I just think that colonization is more than a human process. And I look to books like Ecological Imperialism by Alfred Crosby, who describes the ways in which European settlers brought with them their livestock and weeds and diseases. And it's in that kind of multi-species complex that produces conquest. Humans alone aren't enough. So I think we need to think seriously about invasion as a multi-species process that produces this condition that we're calling Anthropocene, and not shy away from it, which is not to demonize Brazilian pepper or any of the other species that are brought along in this process. But I guess I see it as a real, I see it as a form of violence to use industrial transport systems to schlep organisms everywhere around the world and let them proliferate without taking into consideration the displacements that they're making. But the displacements are, of course, happening alongside these disturbance-making processes and projects. So Brazilian pepper becomes, covers 700,000 acres because we're disturbing the soils in such a way that it creates a niche for it. So if there weren't niches for Brazilian pepper, it wouldn't occupy that much ground. That might be it. I don't know.
What's the attitude of the people that live around the lake towards these birds? What's the attitude of the people who live in the environs of the lake towards the birds and the viability of keeping these colonies of birds?
It's interesting. I mean, you have people who are ambivalent. You have people that think that they're like a spiritual, spiritual thing, that and they go out and appreciate them as a form of like nature loving. And then you have people that fly drones over the habitat of the birds and flush them from the nest, exposing them to sun and predators. And they do so with the knowledge that what they're doing is disruptive, and they've been told so by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, right? So some of these kind of anti-nature humans, I don't know, they exist. I just want to flag them that they exist. And we're all part of that complex too. But yeah. And there's interesting politics around it too. Like, so there's established a no-wake zone, so boats can't again create waves that flush the birds from the nest, which is, subjects the eggs and fledglings to predation.
I just want to pick up on where you ended at the question before, and I'm thinking about on Thursday you talked about the march of the cattails and how the cattails, as I understand it, were already there, but once the phosphorus conditions changed, then the cattails grew and the sawgrass couldn't grow. But it sounds like the Brazilian pepper, you just suggested, okay, the niche changed and that gave it an opportunity. But I'm just wondering, it seems like so many complexities come into play. Like, what did the Brazilian pepper displace in the way in which there's changes in the water management that could reduce cattails that I think is something that's been going on with restoration? Is there that same kind of movement around Brazilian pepper? Does it matter? I'm just thinking about how complex it is and where the points of intervention should be or need to be or are.
I mean, so Celeste was referring to the invasion of cattails into remnant Everglades marshes in the water conservation areas that receive phosphorus-enriched runoff from the Everglades agricultural area and dairies and pastures in the Kissimmee Valley. So all of that nutrient pollution washes into Lake Okeechobee, goes through the EAA and into these water conservation areas, which are impounded Everglades marshes. And you get this eruption of cattails. And once you get cattails, you're getting all kinds of assemblage changes from the, in the tiny worlds of snails and bacteria and periphyton and things like that, but also, habitat for frogs and birds and stuff like that. So it's a major source of, maybe the most important form of environmental degradation in the marshes themselves. I mean, people might disagree with that, but I guess the point is that it's that infrastructure of industrial farming and chemical fertilizers in conjunction with the life history strategies of cattail that are doing that invasive displacement, right? So it's an ensemble effect. And Brazilian pepper in the Lake Somerset context is just one feature of that displacement, right? But it's kind of this like little hopeful bit too, right? It's kind of like the apple snails that give life to snail kites. The invasive apple snail has displaced the native apple snail, but it's like doing really, really well. And so birds that eat it are thriving. And I gotta say, like, that's pretty awesome. So I'm not against things. I'm interested in, it's not about exotic and native distinction. It's about what's worlding the world.
I'm sorry, could you repeat your question? Because we didn't hear it. I didn't hear it when you spoke the first question. I was like, now that there's a hand. Oh, sorry. I know I come late, but I didn't want to interrupt.
Oh, come right back.
The question that I asked more or less was about language when we talk about these changes from Holocene to Anthropocene, and there's a lot of use of language that stems from the military-industrial complex, like invasive and colonization, and it was about trends in the field and whether there are pushes for different forms of language to sort of make, to like change the stage at which we're talking.
Hi, good afternoon. Hi. I'm kind of switching gears. I work for a residency that takes me out to the Everglades and sometimes out to Mekasuki. And I noticed the construction that's taking place out there where they're elevating the roads. I also noticed the water looks insane. It looks absolutely crazy. And so I wanted to know if you have any insight and commentary on the construction that's happening out there, if raising these streets is going to be productive to the ecosystem, if it is going to help in any way, shape, or form, because right now it looks like it's actually doing a detriment to the land, and it doesn't look like that it's helpful. The water is super, super high. Right. It almost looks like it's boiling over. So, I just wanted to know if you had any insight on, yeah, it's insane. It's crazy. Cool. And of course, it's in the, construction phase, and that may be why it looks like that. Yeah, right. But I just wondered, if you had any insight or commentary on that.
I haven't seen it. I'm not in any position to talk about it, but I will. I mean, you're talking about the raising of Tamiami trails to allow for greater hydrological connection to the Everglades National Park. I think that craziness is probably tied to construction, and I think you should trust the engineers. That's my feeling. They're really good at moving around water, and I would think that you can just go to bed and sleep well at night. That's what I would do. But you might be onto something. We'll edit it. Thank you. Thank you.